I didn't argue, I didn't explain myself. When my son looked at me and said, "This year we're celebrating Christmas without you," I simply nodded. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't laugh it off. I didn't pretend I misunderstood. I nodded because, at my age, you learn something important. Disrespect doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes it arrives politely, quietly, wrapped in calm words that leave no space for discussion. And when it does, the worst thing you can do is a rush to defend your worth. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything you could say. Stay with me until the end, because what I did after that Christmas changed everything for them. And if stories of quiet strength, family betrayal, and real-life lessons speak to you, please subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I am a woman in my early 70s, a mother, a grandmother, a widow. I've lived long enough to understand that life doesn't always break you loudly. Sometimes it wears you down slowly, through small moments you're told not to take personally. I raised my children believing in respect, not obedience. Not fear, respect. I taught them that family wasn't something you used when it was convenient. It was something you protected. I wasn't a perfect mother. I made mistakes. But I was present. I stayed up late when they were sick. I stretched meals when money was tight. I listened when no one else did. And when my husband was alive, we worked together quietly, never imagining that one day we'd be raising children who would grow up and forget how much was done for them without applause. When my husband passed away, the house became quieter in ways I wasn't prepared for. The silence wasn't just in the rooms. It settled inside me. I didn't collapse. I didn't fall apart. I adjusted. That's what women of my generation do. We adjust. I learned how to manage on my own. I downsized my life not because I had to, but because I didn't need much anymore. I stopped buying things I didn't use. I stopped filling rooms just to avoid emptiness. What mattered to me now was simple: family, peace, being included. For a long time, I believed I still had those things. Holidays were never extravagant. They didn't need to be. Christmas, especially, had always been about togetherness. I cooked the same meals year after year. Nothing fancy, just familiar. I helped where I could. Sometimes with money, sometimes with childcare. Sometimes by just being there when plans fell apart. I never announced my help. I never reminded anyone of it. I believed that love didn't need to be recorded or repaid. For a while, everything felt normal. But then, gradually, something began to change. It wasn't obvious at first. No arguments, no confrontations. Just small shifts that were easy to ignore, if you wanted to. Phone calls became shorter. Plans were mentioned after they had already been made. Sometimes I would hear about family gatherings from someone else's mouth before I heard it from my own son. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself this was just how families evolve. Children grow. Lives get busy. I didn't want to be the mother who complains, the one who makes everything about herself, so I stayed quiet. But the feeling didn't leave. It lingered. I noticed how my questions were answered quickly, as if they were interruptions. I noticed how my suggestions were dismissed politely, then ignored. I noticed how my help was accepted without gratitude, as if it were expected. And slowly, something painful became clear. I was still useful, but I was no longer considered. There is a difference between being loved and being tolerated, and that difference hurts in ways that are difficult to explain. Still, I said nothing. I believed patience was a virtue. I believed silence would protect peace. Then Christmas came closer. I had already begun preparing quietly, as I always did, not with excitement, but with habit. One evening, my son asked to stop by. He didn't sound nervous on the phone, just formal. We sat at the table, nothing dramatic, no raised voices, no tension in the air. He cleared his throat and avoided my eyes. Then he said it. "This year we're keeping Christmas small." I waited. "We're celebrating at home," he continued. "Just us." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I stayed still. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "My wife feels uncomfortable." That was it. No explanation of why. No discussion, no apology, just a statement. The calmness of his voice hurt more than anger ever could, because anger would have meant emotion. It would have meant care. This was certainty. I looked at him and nodded. I smiled, because that's what I've done my whole life when I needed to keep myself together. "I understand," I said, and I meant it. I understood that something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. When someone excludes you without hesitation, without discomfort, without even asking how you feel, that's when you realize they've already decided your place. I went home that night alone. I didn't cry. I sat quietly and replayed the conversation over and over. Not angrily. Carefully, I noticed what wasn't said, what wasn't offered. No compromise, no alternative, just absence. And for the first time, I allowed myself to stop making excuses for behavior that had been hurting me for a long time. I saw the pattern clearly: the gradual distancing, the unspoken expectations, the assumption that I would always be there financially, emotionally, practically, but only when needed, not when it mattered. That night, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of clarity. I didn't call anyone, I didn't announce anything. I simply stopped. I stopped offering help before it was requested. I stopped covering small expenses quietly. I stopped fixing problems that weren't mine to fix. I didn't withdraw from the drama. I withdrew with dignity. Days passed, then weeks. At first, nothing changed. Christmas came and went without me. I spent that day quietly. I cooked a small meal. I sat by the window. I allowed myself to feel the sadness without letting it consume me. I told myself the truth. This wasn't punishment. This was reality. And then, slowly, things began to shift, but that part comes next. The first sign that something had changed came quietly. Not with an apology, not with understanding, with inconvenience. A few days after Christmas, my phone rang. I let it ring longer than usual before answering. It was my son. His voice was casual. Too casual. He asked how I was doing. Then, without pausing long enough for an answer, he mentioned a problem. A small one, he said, nothing serious. They were short on money that month. Unexpected expenses. A repair they hadn't planned for. I listened. I said nothing. There was a pause on the line, the kind that waits for reassurance. For a solution, it didn't come. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I thought maybe you could help just this once." Just this once. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. Not because I was angry, but because I understood something very clearly in that moment. My absence hadn't been felt. My help had. I told him gently that I couldn't. No explanation, no justification. Just, "I can't." There was silence on the other end. Then confusion. Then disappointment, carefully hidden. He said he understood. But his voice told me he didn't. When the call ended, I sat quietly and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Peace, not relief, not satisfied, peace. Because for the first time I had responded honestly instead of automatically. Days passed. Then another call came, this time from his wife. Her tone was polite, measured. She asked if I was upset. I said no. She said she hoped I knew the Christmas decision wasn't personal. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said something simple. "I understand your choices," I told her, "but I'm allowed to make my own as well." She didn't know what to say to that. After that, the calls came more frequently. Not angry, concerned, confused. They spoke carefully now, as if unsure where they stood. And that uncertainty, that unfamiliar feeling of not knowing what to expect from me, was the beginning of the shift. Weeks passed. The small inconveniences grew into larger problems. Bills piled up. Plans fell apart. Things I had quietly supported for years were suddenly visible by their absence. And with each passing day, they were reminded of something they had taken for granted. I wasn't just a mother, I was a foundation, and foundations are only noticed when they stop holding everything up. One afternoon, my son came to see me. He looked tired. Older, he didn't sit down right away. He stood in my doorway like a guest. That alone told me everything. He finally said he didn't realize how much I had been helping. I didn't interrupt him. He said things had been hard since Christmas. I nodded. He said they missed having me around. I waited. Then he said something that surprised me. He apologized, not fully, not deeply, but sincerely enough to matter. He admitted he hadn't considered how excluding me would feel. He said he thought I would understand. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw a man who had grown used to comfort without thinking about its source. I told him something I had never said before. "I did understand," I said. "I just didn't agree." He sat down after that. We talked quietly, no accusations, no raised voices. I didn't list everything I had done for them. I didn't remind him of sacrifices. I simply explained how it felt to be included only when convenient, to be valued for support, but not for presence. He listened, truly listened. And when he left that day, something between us had changed, not fully healed, but real. The following months were different, not perfect, but honestly. I was invited again, not automatically, but intentionally. And I noticed something important. They asked now, they didn't assume, they appreciated it. And I learned something too, that love without boundaries becomes an obligation, that generosity without respect becomes entitlement. And that silence, when used wisely, can teach lessons words never will. I didn't punish my son. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped filling a role that had quietly erased me, and in doing so, I found myself again. I still love my family, but I no longer disappear inside that love. Because dignity isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It steps back and lets others finally see the space it once occupied. That Christmas didn't break me. It showed me the truth. And once you see it, you don't unseen it. Sometimes, the strongest response is knowing when to step aside and allow others to grow. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt quietly pushed aside by those you loved most, remember this. You don't have to fight to be valued. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the most powerful lesson is the one you teach by standing still. And that lesson is never forgotten.